recorded an episode. I haven't recorded an episode in a while. But I'm bored, so I'm gonna parse through my notes. I've been reading the Holy Grail of Macroeconomics for the last few weeks. So, let's see. A couple of flashcards and... This is not gonna be entertaining, but... whatever. Bored. So, first flashcard is bubble spotting. Richard Coos says, after all, a bubble becomes a bubble when asset prices reach a level that can no longer be justified by the DCF analysis. Yes, I remember I wrote that down because the point he was making is that after a large asset bubble bursts, the only kind of analysis most big Wall Street analysts are going to be doing is DCF analysis, which is like, I think it's something cash flow. No, decentralized cash flow. Now I'm gonna look this up. Looking shit up. Let's see, DCF analysis. Analysis. Thinking discounted cash flow. An evaluation method used to estimate the value of an investment based on its expected future cash flows. Okay. So because during a bubble, nobody really cares what the expected future earnings of a company are, because they're just buying the hype. After a bubble, everybody wants to base their investments on discounted cash flow. So that's note 1. And note 2, Paul Krugman was dumb even then. Oh yeah, I put that into my flashcards, but that's not actually all that important. But reading through it, in a dialogue between Professor Krugman and myself that was transcribed in the November 1999 issue of Bungai Shunji magazine, he said that he did not think it was particularly important to understand the causes of deflation in Japan's economy. Although the effectiveness of monetary policy may vary to some extent with structural conditions in the economy, he asserted the laws of economics dictate that demand can be stimulated by printing money, and therefore boosting the money supply will always have some effect. I responded to Professor Krugman by saying that asset price inflation of 200% to 300% would be needed to pull people out of balance sheet repair mode, and that these bubble-era asset prices would have to be maintained in perpetuity, which was impossible. He quickly responded by saying that is why Japan needs a 200% or 300% inflation rate. Okay, so the reason I chose to write that one down is because I really hate Paul Krugman, and this really just shows how dumb he is. Japan had like a 2% deflation rate at the time, and he's saying that they need to pull the economy out of that by causing hyperinflation. And the reason, of course, is because he wasn't really thinking about the economy; he was thinking about the stock market. That's kind of his whole shtick. Whatever the rich people need, he comes up with the justification for it, even if it would destroy an entire country. The next note in my flashcards is hyperinflation is not a worse kind of normal inflation. Although a central bank can always generate hyperinflation by acting so as to lose the public's trust, its ability to induce modest amounts of inflation depend on whether private businesses are in profit maximization mode or not. If firms are maximizing profits, the central bank can create mild inflation by injecting more liquidity. But if firms are instead minimizing debt, no amount of liquidity injected by the central bank will generate inflation. So, the point there is pretty self-explanatory. Hyperinflation is not normal inflation. Hyperinflation is a result of a widespread distrust of the money. So basically people dumping their dollars and not really wanting to use them because they don't know if they're going to be worth anything later. Like what a lot of people think is going to happen with Bitcoin, and where they for some reason think that people are going to stop using fiat currencies and instead buy Bitcoin and that would cause hyperinflation of those fiat currencies, because they would no longer really be worth anything. But normal inflation is largely the result of corporate sector borrowing and the money multiplier effect, so it's not the same thing. So hyperinflation should probably have a completely different name, because it's not really inflation. It's basically people just giving up on their government, giving up on their government's money, and not trusting them to manage the economy the way they normally would. It's kind of like an economic revolution. And the next note in my flashcards is Bernanke's reductio ad absurdum. Where Bernanke's argument went something like this: if sustained government bond purchases by the Bank of Japan, it would not generate inflation as argued by the bank at the time. The bank should be able to purchase an unlimited amount of government debt, thereby allowing the government to eliminate all taxes. Given that this scenario, i.e. a tax-free nation, is clearly impossible, something must be wrong with the bank's premise that central bank purchases of government debt will not lead to inflation. And the response to that, and from Richard Koo, is, although it is an interesting line of reasoning, it actually makes a huge leap of logic. This is because the bank's purchases of government debt do not generate inflation. Rather, the resumption of borrowing and spending by firms that have finished repairing their balance sheets do. When this happens, a massive round of credit creation will commence if the banking system is awash in liquidity, which in turn can lead to severe inflation. So the kind of TLDR there is the government spending money doesn't, or the central bank creating money, that is, doesn't cause inflation. Inflation is caused by the corporate sector borrowing money. It's caused by businesses deciding that they need to take out loans in order to expand. And so Bernanke's reductio ad absurdum is largely just absurd. And it requires a belief that the mere printing of money is enough to cause inflation. When to devalue currency to cover trade deficits is the next one. And this one was kind of interesting. For a nation that is running a trade deficit and has little domestic savings, currency devaluation is the right way to reduce the deficit. So a lot of people point out that Trump during his presidency had a weak dollar policy. That was actually the right policy in order to try and reverse our trade deficits. And it's because we do have huge trade deficits with other countries, and that's largely a function of our currency strength. And having a strong currency usually leads to trade deficits because you can purchase more things from abroad and less things at home. So when you weaken the currency, more people abroad can purchase from you, and while you can purchase less from them. Small government correlates with but does not cause prosperity. This is not as easy as it sounds because most people tend to regard smaller government and self-reliance on the part of the private sector as universally correct precepts that apply under all circumstances. They do so not only because these principles seem correct, but also because they are associated with the rapid economic growth and prosperity typical of Yang phases. By the way, Yang phases are the good half of yin-yang phases, which is a concept Richard Koo puts forward in the book. And that sometimes the economy is in a yin phase where corporations are repairing their balance sheets, debt minimization is happening, and so the government actually can't do much with monetary policy and has to focus on fiscal policy. And at that time, big government, like Germany in the 1930s, and the US in the 1930s for that matter, in both nations, monetary policy ended up doing nothing but either making things worse or leaving things more or less the same. But when fiscal policy was put in place, so when the government actually started spending money into the economy and acting as a borrower of last resort, then things improved in both countries. And of course, we had to fight the Germans, and so that kind of helped us with getting past any idea that we needed to do like economic responsibility, or whatever they like to call it, austerity. So yeah, anyways, typical of Yang phases. But the truth of the matter is that the economy prospered under smaller government because it was already in a Yang phase, with healthy corporate balance sheets. So basically, the Yang phase is when the corporations have healthy balance sheets, so they're borrowing more and they're expanding more and focusing on profit maximization, not debt minimization. And during those periods, smaller government is okay, it's good, and it's unobtrusive, which is nice. But it's also not really a necessity because the economy is good in spite of the government, not because of the government at that time. And the government in a Yang phase is largely a non sequitur. It's just there to manipulate the money, basically. Monetary policy works well in a yang phase, while fiscal policy doesn't really do much in a yang phase. Alright, and this one is yin-yang phase, default to Keynes. Or, wait. Oh no, yin phase. Oh no, this one is called yin phase. This one is labeled yin phase, default to Keynes. Means which, okay. Interestingly, Keynesians made similar mistakes in the opposite direction in the 1950s and 1960s, not realizing that their policy recommendations were valid only during a yin phase. So basically, the Keynesians were very big on monetary policy and largely ignored fiscal policy. Or rather, they were very big on fiscal policy and largely ignored monetary policy. They were the economists of the New Deal, basically. All the government spending, all the welfare systems, which, you know, that stuff is nice, but you can't really be overt about it in a phase when the economy is doing well. Oh, the yin phases, and though that's generally the time for it. Anyways, not realizing that their policy recommendations were only valid during a yin phase, they tried to fine-tune major economies using fiscal policy, but their efforts only resulted in more inflation and higher interest rates because the economies were already in a yang phase. The result was disastrous. Resource allocation was distorted, inflation accelerated, interest rates crept upward, and growth often stagnated. Okay, so this is an important point to look at. So, the Keynesians gave us the golden age of economic expansion, and largely because they got us out of the Great Depression, which was a yin phase, and a balance sheet recession. But ultimately all of that inflation ended up becoming a problem when the expansion slowed. And we got into the stagflation crisis in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of people say Reagan saved the economy by raising interest rates to 20% or around 18%. And that's not actually what happened, and the interest rates went up on their own. And he just chose to let Paul Volcker step back and not stop them from going up. Because that's what happens when you have inflation. Interest rates go up. Because now the value of the money people expect to get back when they lend and is lower, so they need more money to compensate. Okay. Anyways, Keynesian policy, so highly touted after the Great Depression, gradually lost credibility, and fiscal stimulus itself came to be shunned, which is a terrible mistake. Because obviously according to Richard Kuh's theories, which I think is reasonable enough, the economy moves in cycles, where sometimes monetary policy works, sometimes fiscal policy works, and the opposite policy becomes counterproductive. So you can't shun one or the other. You have to be willing to use whichever one works at the time. So those are my flashcards. It's on the Holy Grail of Macroeconomics. Thanks. I actually had some things highlighted here and there that I found pretty interesting that I didn't put into my notes. So let's see. The first indicator they should look at will be the level of interest rates, including those of government bonds. Okay, so this note is here from recently, because I got to page 177 so far. Or actually a bit past that, but that's where I left a note. And basically now he's laying out how to spot it, whether you're in a yin phase or yang phase. And the first indicator you look at, and according to Richard Kuh, is the level of interest rates, including those of government bonds. And it's because if the interest rates are low, you are likely in a yin phase, and if they're high, you're likely in a yang phase. Which makes sense because in a yang phase, corporations are trying to look after their profits more. And they're not doing debt minimization. So the higher interest rates, the rising interest rates, mean that more private sector borrowing is going on. Oh, and of course, these days looking at the government interest rate is kind of dumb, and because the government manipulates interest rates all the way down to zero. But when you look at the private interest rate, the private interest rate isn't decided by the government interest rate. And so looking at how high the interest rate is when the corporations lend, and actually is a bit more useful. Though it's still distorted because the government is distorting the interest rates. I think this book kind of needs an update, so that we can kind of keep track of stuff like that, and then figure out how to navigate around it when we're trying to understand the economic system and the economic cycles. But, kind of difficult. New rules get invented every day about economics. So anyways, I guess the stock market is back in an uptrend from what I've seen. Tentative uptrend, but uptrend, so that's nice. Yes. Wonder how Bitcoin is doing. I don't own any Bitcoin, by the way. I do own a lot of Ethereum, though. Oh, and none of this is financial advice. I'm not a advisor. But I'm gonna check out how the crypto market's doing right now. If Coinbase loads up, which this shit takes forever. I think with all that blockchain technology, they would be able to load at least half as fast as Robinhood can. Oh well. Oh, round, and okay. Alright, Bitcoin's up like 2% today. It dropped all the way to like 31,000. Now it's at 37,000, so that's nice. Ethereum's down 0.96%. And honestly, I'm hoping it goes down a lot more than that. So right now I'm just holding some cash in reserve for that. Gonna check my Polygon holdings. I want to see if Polygon ever moved. Probably moved in the same direction as Ethereum, though. Oh yeah, Polygon's down. Gonna buy more later. But right now, I think I can get a better price. Nice. This looks a lot like a descending wedge. Or, so might not get to buy lower. No foul. I already own some. I'm hoping it collapses all the way back down to 1 cent. And all these dumb speculators, they can't see the value of anything. So I'm just gonna buy the dips and wait them out. Anyways, that's about all I've got. I'm kind of a boring person.